A poor black maid, handcuffed like a criminal, had just saved a billionaire's son's life. The police called it theft. The billionaire called it betrayal. But when the truth came out, the entire city was left speechless. This is the story you were never meant to hear. Imagine risking your job, your freedom, and your entire future, all for a child who isn't even yours. This is the true story of how one poor maid's desperate choice shocked the entire world. Grace Williams adjusted the straps on little Ethan's sandals, trying to keep her hands steady. Normally, the 5-year-old, son of her wealthy employer, billionaire Alexander Cole, was a burst of non-stop energy. But today, he sat in silence, his head drooping forward, eyes half closed. "Ethan? Sweetheart? Are you okay?" Grace's voice cracked as she pressed her palm to his forehead. Heat radiated from his skin, so fierce it startled her. He didn't respond, only blinked weakly before his tiny body went limp. "Ethan!" Grace's scream tore through the empty marble halls. She caught him before his head could hit the floor. His face was pale, lips tinged blue. His shallow breaths were almost invisible. Panic shot through her. The mansion's intercom was broken. The cook was in the guest house. The butler had stepped out. She fumbled for her phone, dialing Alexander's private emergency line. No answer. She called 911. "Ambulance ETA, 12 to 15 minutes, the operator said flatly. 15 minutes? Ethan might not have 5. Grace's frantic eyes darted to the courtyard. There, bathed in sunlight, was Alexander's pride and joy, a gleaming black Lamborghini Aventador. He had forbidden her from ever touching it. Her heart pounded. If she drove it, she'd be fired, maybe even arrested. But if she didn't, Ethan could die in her arms. "God forgive me," she whispered, scooping him up. She bolted for the door, every step pushing her closer to a choice she could never undo. The forbidden choice. Grace burst through the heavy front doors, the cool breeze slapping her face as the sprawling driveway stretched before her. The Lamborghini gleamed under the sun like a predator waiting to be unleashed, its sleek black frame a symbol of wealth she could never touch. Alexander's voice echoed in her head from the day she'd been caught dusting too close to it. "Grace, you are never, under any circumstances, to touch this car. Not even a fingerprint. Do you understand?" She had nodded back then, swallowing the sting of humiliation. Now, Ethan's limp weight in her arms made that memory feel meaningless. She yanked open the passenger door and lowered him gently into the leather seat, strapping him in with trembling hands. "Just hold on, baby, just hold on," she whispered, brushing a damp curl from his forehead. Sliding into the driver's seat, Grace gripped the steering wheel, her yellow cleaning gloves still on. The moment the key turned, the engine roared to life like a beast waking from slumber, its growl vibrating through her bones. She slammed her foot down, and the tires screamed, scattering gravel in every direction. The iron gates groaned open, the security cameras tracking every second of her defiance. Her pulse raced as the world blurred past, trees, fences, the long manicured hedge, all melting into streaks of green. Each second felt stolen, borrowed from a future that might not forgive her. In her mind, she pictured the ambulance crawling through traffic, still minutes away, and she pressed harder on the accelerator. The Aventador surged forward, the force shoving her back into the seat. In the corner of her eye, Ethan's chest rose and fell weakly, and Grace's throat tightened with both fear and determination. She knew there was no turning back. Whatever happened after this, she had already crossed the line between obedience and survival. Racing against death, the Lamborghini shot onto the open road like a bullet, the engine's furious roar swallowing every other sound. Grace's hands clenched the wheel so tightly her knuckles burned, her foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. Her heart pounded in sync with the deafening engine, each beat reminding her that Ethan's breaths were shallow and uneven. She stole a glance at him, his small head lolled to the side, lips now a frightening shade of purple, his tiny body twitching in occasional spasms. "Stay with me, Ethan, please stay with me," she murmured, voice breaking. A red light loomed ahead, but stopping wasn't an option. She blew through it, horns blaring, tires shrieking as an oncoming truck missed her by inches. The truck driver's furious shout faded in the wind behind her. Sweat trickled down her back, her stomach churning with adrenaline and dread. Every second felt like a coin flipping between life and death. In her mind, she pictured Alexander's rage, the police waiting to take her away, the headlines branding her a thief, but none of that mattered if Ethan didn't make it. Up ahead, 2 delivery vans blocked most of the lane, crawling side by side like a barricade. Grace's pulse spiked. She slammed the gear down, swerving into a razor-thin gap between them, the side mirror grazing metal with a screech. She barely noticed, Her eyes were fixed on the distant outline of St. Joseph's Hospital rising above the rooftops. She whispered a desperate prayer. "God, let me make it, please." The Aventador roared louder, as if sharing her urgency, devouring the asphalt beneath its tires. With every block she conquered, the hospital drew closer, but so did the terrifying realization that Ethan's life was hanging by a thread that could snap at any second. The hospital in sight, the sharp spire of St. Joseph's Hospital, grew larger with every breathless second, but to Grace it still felt miles away. Her eyes darted between the road and Ethan, whose fragile breaths now came so slowly it was as if time itself was trying to steal them. "Don't you dare give up on me," she muttered, her voice trembling with both fear and defiance. She pressed the accelerator harder, the Lamborghini's engine howling in protest as it tore down the final stretch of road. Cars ahead shifted lanes in panic, their drivers staring wide-eyed at the black blur that thundered past. Her vision tunneled, blocking out everything but the looming white building. The hospital driveway approached, but so did a wall of pedestrians crossing the street. Grace slammed the brakes, tires shrieking in agony as the car fishtailed before she whipped it around them, narrowly missing an elderly man who shouted curses in her wake. She didn't care, every second was a battle. The ER entrance finally came into full view, its sliding glass doors flashing red and white under the glow of emergency lights. Grace's chest tightened with a surge of desperate hope. She drove straight up to the curb, braking so hard that smoke poured from the tires. Before the engine had even stopped growling, she was out of the driver's seat, running to the passenger side. She flung the door open, scooping Ethan into her arms. His head rolled against her shoulder, lifeless, his lips an unholy shade of blue. "Please. Somebody help," she screamed as she bolted toward the entrance, her voice echoing off the glass. Doctors and nurses rushed forward, their faces snapping from confusion to urgency the moment they saw the boy. Grace stumbled inside, her lungs burning, knowing she'd just crossed the finish line in a race she could not afford to lose. From hero to suspect, the sliding glass doors yawned open as Grace staggered into the bright, sterile chaos of the emergency room, clutching Ethan's limp body to her chest. "He's not breathing right. Please, he needs help now," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. A nurse with quick, practiced movements swept Ethan from her arms and barked orders to the team. They rushed him toward a trauma bay, the squeal of gurney wheels cutting through the air. Grace stood frozen for a moment, chest heaving, her legs trembling from the adrenaline still pounding in her veins. Through the glass partition, she caught glimpses of frantic hands working over Ethan, oxygen mask pressed to his face, wires snaking across his small chest, monitors beeping erratically. She whispered a shaky prayer, her eyes never leaving him. But before she could step closer, a sharp, commanding voice rang out behind her. Turn around and place your hands on your head." She spun around, startled, to find two uniformed police officers advancing toward her. Confusion tangled with fear in her chest. "What? No, wait, I just brought him here, he was dying." One officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, his tone flat and unyielding. "You've been reported for stealing Alexander Cole's Lamborghini. You have the right to remain silent." Cold metal snapped around her wrists, biting into her skin. Gasps rippled through the waiting area as onlookers realized the woman who just carried in a dying child was now being treated like a criminal. "Please, you don't understand." Grace pleaded, tears stinging her eyes. "I had no choice, he's my boss's son, he wouldn't have made it if I'd waited." But her words met only hardened stares. As they began escorting her toward the exit, she twisted her head for one last desperate glance at Ethan through the glass. His tiny body lay still under a halo of medical staff, and her heart shattered at the thought that she might never see him alive again. The billionaire's fury in the heart of downtown, on the top floor of a towering glass skyscraper, Alexander Cole was in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting when his personal phone buzzed. Seeing his head of security's name flash on the screen, he stepped out into the hallway with an impatient sigh. "What is it, Daniel? I told you not to interrupt unless it's urgent." Daniel's voice came through tense and hesitant. "Sir, your Lamborghini has been stolen." Alexander's expression hardened instantly, his grip tightening around the phone. "Stolen? By who?" There was a pause, then Daniel's words landed like a slap. "Grace Williams, sir. We have her on security footage driving it out through the front gates." For a moment, Alexander thought he'd misheard. Grace? The quiet, obedient maid who had worked in his household for years without a hint of trouble? His disbelief quickly burned into cold rage. "I want the police on her now. She's to be arrested immediately. No leniency." "Sir, there may be more too," Daniel began, but Alexander cut him off sharply. "I don't care what her excuse is. She's crossed the line. That car is worth more than she'll see in a lifetime. Hanging up, Alexander stood alone in the hallway, his jaw tight, his mind swirling with anger and betrayal. He pictured Grace's face, the way she'd always avoided direct eye contact, always kept her tone respectful. And now she had repaid his trust by stealing his most prized possession. He strode back into the boardroom, but the meeting was a blur. His thoughts were consumed by her audacity. In his mind, Grace wasn't just a thief, she was a liar who had taken advantage of his generosity. What he didn't know was that at that exact moment, she wasn't joyriding in his Lamborghini, she was in the ER, fighting to keep his only son alive. Fighting for Ethan's life back at St. Joseph's, the trauma bay was a whirlwind of motion as the medical team worked furiously over Ethan's tiny body. The steady beep of the heart monitor was alarmingly slow, his oxygen levels flashing in dangerous red numbers on the screen. A doctor barked, "Epinephrine, now. Push 1 milligram." A nurse moved quickly, injecting the medication while another adjusted the oxygen mask on Ethan's pale face. Grace, still in handcuffs just outside the glass partition, strained forward as far as the officer's grip would allow, her eyes locked on every frantic movement inside. Her chest ached with helplessness. She wanted to tell them about his sudden collapse, about the burning heat she'd felt on his skin, but the officer pulled her back. "You need to come with us," he said firmly. "Not until I know he's okay," she shot back, her voice trembling. The officer's expression softened for a fraction of a second, but his grip didn't loosen. Inside the bay, Ethan's small body gave a sudden, weak jerk. Grace's stomach dropped. "Come on, baby, fight," she whispered under her breath. The doctor leaned over him, listening intently to his chest before nodding to the team. "We've got a pulse improvement, keep the oxygen high flow. Let's stabilize him for transport to pediatric ICU." Relief washed over Grace so hard her knees nearly buckled, but fear still gnawed at her, he was far from safe. As they wheeled Ethan toward the elevators, the sliding glass doors shut between them, leaving Grace staring at the empty space where he'd been. The officer tugged at her arm again, and with one last glance at the ICU doors, she let herself be led away, not knowing that Alexander was already on his way to the hospital, carrying a fury that would soon collide head-on with the truth. Collision of truth and anger. The polished black Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of St. Joseph's Hospital, its tires barely missing the curb. Alexander Cole stepped out, his expensive suit immaculate but his expression thunderous, the kind of cold fury that made people shrink back without a word. Bystanders recognized him instantly. Whispers rippled through the crowd as he strode toward the ER doors like a man on a mission. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and the muted beeping of machines filled the air. Alexander's eyes scanned the reception area until he spotted a uniformed officer escorting a handcuffed Grace toward the exit. His jaw clenched. "Unbelievable," he muttered, taking long strides toward them. "So it's true," he said coldly, his voice dripping with contempt. Grace froze, her breath hitching as she turned to face him. "Mr. Cole, please, Ethan, don't say his name," Alexander snapped, cutting her off. "You stole my car, Grace. My car. After everything I've done for you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced the words out, her voice cracking. "He was dying. I called for help, they said 15 minutes. He didn't have 15 minutes. Alexander's glare didn't soften, but something flickered in his eyes. "Where is he now?" he demanded. The officer spoke up. "Sir, the boy's in ICU. The doctors say the woman brought him in just in time." Alexander's head turned sharply toward the ICU corridor. His heartbeat quickened, the anger in his chest wrestling with an unfamiliar dread. Without another word, he brushed past Grace and the officer, heading straight toward the pediatric unit. Each step felt heavier as he imagined his son lying helpless, and for the first time since the call, he began to wonder if his judgment had been fatally wrong. The doctor's verdict. Alexander's polished shoes clicked sharply against the gleaming hospital floor as he approached the pediatric ICU, his pulse drumming in his ears. Through the wide glass window, he caught sight of Ethan lying pale and still, dwarfed by the hospital bed and surrounded by a maze of wires and tubes. His small chest rose and fell weakly under the oxygen mask, the steady beep of monitors keeping rhythm with the fragile thread of life holding him here. A tall, composed man in a white coat stepped forward, Dr. Marcus Hale, the hospital's chief physician. "Mr. Cole?" he asked, his tone calm but grave. Alexander nodded stiffly. "How is my son?" Dr. Hale glanced back at Ethan before meeting Alexander's eyes. "He suffered an acute anaphylactic reaction. Severe. If he had arrived even a few minutes later, we wouldn't have been able to save him." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from his chest. "But he's alive, because someone brought him here in time?" he asked, his voice suddenly quieter, almost unsure. Dr. Hale's expression softened. "Yes." The woman who arrived with him, Grace Williams, acted quickly and without hesitation. "She got him here just in time for us to intervene. Without her, your son wouldn't be here." Alexander froze, the doctor's words slicing through the certainty he'd carried all day. Images flashed in his mind, Grace's tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, the desperation in her voice when she said Ethan was dying. A sick twist of guilt coiled in his stomach. "She saved him," he murmured, almost to himself. Dr. Hale nodded firmly. "Yes. Whatever else you think of her, know this, Grace Williams is the reason your son is alive right now." Alexander turned to the glass again, staring at Ethan, but all he could see now was the possibility that he had condemned an innocent woman without ever stopping to ask why. Face to face, Alexander stood frozen outside the ICU, his reflection in the glass staring back at him like a stranger. The weight of the doctor's words pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. Grace had saved Ethan. Grace, the same woman he had just ordered arrested without a shred of mercy. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, but there was no time to wallow in it. He turned abruptly and strode down the corridor toward the small holding room where the officer had taken her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he approached the heavy door. Through the narrow glass panel, he saw her sitting hunched in a chair, her wrists still cuffed, her head bowed, shoulders trembling with silent sobs. The sight hit him harder than he expected. Without hesitation, he pushed the door open. Grace looked up, startled, her eyes red and swollen. When she saw him, her expression tightened, not with fear, but with a kind of exhausted defiance. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice shaking, "I swear I never meant," he held up a hand, cutting her off. "Grace, stop. I know." She blinked, unsure what he meant. Alexander stepped closer, his voice lower, raw with something she'd never heard from him before, regret. "The doctors told me. You saved Ethan's life. If you hadn't done what you did, he wouldn't be here right now." Her lips parted, but no words came. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, her eyes full of disbelief, his shadowed with guilt. Finally, Alexander looked at the officer standing in the corner. "Unlock her cuffs. Now." The officer hesitated, glancing between them, then obeyed. The cold steel fell away from Grace's wrists, leaving faint red marks. She rubbed them absently, still too stunned to speak. Alexander took a slow breath. "Grace, I owe you more than I can ever repay."